The nurse who said nothing. My name is Ava. I am 34 years old and I work as a nurse. Last month I attended my stepsister's wedding dinner. I wore a simple navy dress, chose a seat near the end of the long reception table, and fully intended to spend the entire evening being invisible. That was the plan. That was always the plan whenever Lily was involved. I had wrapped a small gift box in white paper and tied it with a thin silver ribbon. Nothing extravagant, just something thoughtful, the kind of thing I always chose because I genuinely wanted to celebrate her, even when she made that difficult, even when she made it nearly impossible. The hall was stunning. I'll give her that. Soft amber lighting poured down from fixtures strung along the ceiling, and white floral arrangements covered every surface. The scent of gardenias floated through the room. A live band played near the back, and everywhere I looked people were dressed in things that cost more than my monthly rent. I walked in quietly, found my seat, placed the gift on the collection table near the entrance, and told myself to simply get through the night. That was my only goal. Lily had always been the center of everything. Growing up in the same house with her after my mother remarried her father, I learned very quickly that the two of us occupied completely different spaces in that family, even when we shared the same roof. She had private tutors and international vacations. I had a part-time job at a pharmacy on weekends, and a scholarship application I rewrote 4 times before it was accepted. She had designer bags before she was 16. I had a used nursing textbook with someone else's highlights still in it. None of that made me bitter. I want to be clear about that. I chose nursing because of what I had seen when my father was sick. I had watched the nurses on his floor move through impossible situations with a kind of steadiness that stayed with me for years. When everyone else in a room was falling apart, they didn't. They just kept working. That meant something to me. It still does. But to Lily, my career was a punchline she had never quite figured out how to deliver properly until tonight. Her new husband, whose name was Owen, seemed genuinely kind from the little I had observed. He moved through the reception with calm confidence, introducing Lily to his relatives with obvious affection, laughing at the right moments, and never seeming to perform for the room the way Lily sometimes did. His father, a silver-haired man named Raymond, sat near the center of the main table and carried himself with a quiet kind of weight. Not arrogance. Something more settled than that. Something earned. I noticed him early in the evening because he was one of the few people at the reception who didn't seem particularly interested in being noticed. The dinner service had begun, and the room had settled into that comfortable noise of clinking silverware and overlapping conversations. I was midway through my salad when Lily stood up. She tapped the side of her glass with a small spoon. The sharp, repeating sound spread through the room and conversation dropped in layers until the hall was mostly quiet. Lily smiled the way she always smiled when she had the attention of a room, wide, composed, practiced. She turned and looked directly at me. "I want to introduce someone," she announced. She waved her hand in my direction with the casual ease of someone gesturing toward a piece of furniture. "That's my stepsister, Ava. Come here for a second." I didn't want to stand, but staying seated would have drawn more attention than complying, and I had learned that lesson early in life. So I set my fork down, folded my napkin, and walked toward the main table while the room watched. Lily put her hand on my shoulder the moment I reached her. Her grip was light, performative. Her smile stayed exactly where it was. She turned toward Raymond's side of the table specifically, toward Owen's family. "This is Ava," she said warmly. Then she let a small, undeliberate pause settle before she continued. "She's just a nurse." A few people chuckled. Someone across the table murmured something to the person beside them and nodded with a polite, distracted smile. It wasn't cruel laughter exactly, more like the reflexive response of people who weren't sure what the joke was but assumed there must be one. I smiled. I had practiced that smile for years without realizing it. "That's a lovely thing," one of Owen's aunts said from nearby, and I appreciated her for it, even though it was clearly an attempt to move past an awkward moment rather than a genuine defense. Lily had already pivoted back toward the room. She was talking again, something about the centerpieces, something about the venue, and the moment slid into the background of the evening the way those moments usually do. I returned to my seat. I picked up my fork. I told myself it didn't matter. And then I noticed Raymond. He had stopped eating. His fork was resting against the side of his plate, and he was looking at me with an expression I didn't recognize at first. Not rudely, not with the polite disinterest most guests had shown. He was studying my face the way a person does when they're searching for the specific context that makes a familiar thing make sense. I looked away, assuming it would pass. It didn't pass. Owen noticed the shift in his father's attention and leaned toward him slightly. "Everything all right?" Raymond nodded slowly without fully looking at his son. "Yes," he said quietly. "Fine." But his attention hadn't moved from somewhere around my general direction, and his expression had taken on a particular stillness that I recognized from a very different context. It was the expression of someone doing serious internal work. Lily launched into a detailed account of the honeymoon itinerary. Rome, she said, then the Amalfi Coast, then possibly a few days somewhere quieter because Owen had been specifically requesting somewhere quieter, though she personally found quiet places slightly boring after the second day. Several guests laughed warmly. Owen smiled in the patient way of someone who had already accepted this about the person he was marrying and found it more charming than exhausting. The second course arrived. Plates were placed and removed with quiet efficiency, and the band shifted to something slower and slightly jazzy, filling the spaces in conversation without demanding attention. Raymond finally spoke. He addressed no one in particular, but his voice was low enough that only the people immediately near him heard it clearly. "I know her from somewhere," he said. Owen glanced toward me again. "Ava?" Raymond nodded. He rubbed the side of his jaw slowly. "There's something. I can't place it yet." Lily laughed lightly from across the table. "Oh, Raymond, Ava's not famous, I promise you." Several people smiled. Someone nearby made a small joke about mistaken identities at weddings, and the table softened back into its usual rhythm. But Raymond wasn't laughing, and I was watching him without appearing to watch him, because something about the quality of his attention had started to make my chest feel tight in a way I hadn't expected. He was somewhere in his late 60s, I estimated. Healthy, composed. Clearly someone who had spent decades making important decisions and had developed the internal infrastructure to carry them without showing the weight. The kind of man who, if he told you something quietly, you believed it immediately, not because of the volume, but because of the certainty underneath. He looked at me one more time. "I'm sorry," he said politely, addressing me directly for the first time. "Have we met somewhere before?" "I'm not sure," I replied carefully. "I meet a lot of people through work." He nodded. "That makes sense." He looked down again. "That actually might be it." The band increased its tempo slightly, and several younger guests moved toward the small dance area near the stage. Lily grabbed Owen's hand and pulled him in that direction, with an enthusiasm that suggested she had been waiting for exactly this moment since the salads arrived. The table shifted and loosened as people stood and migrated. Raymond stayed seated. I almost left. I had every reason to excuse myself, find a quieter corner of the reception hall, and spend the remaining hour nursing a glass of sparkling water until it was appropriate to collect my coat. But something kept me at the edge of the table, and I wasn't entirely sure what it was. He looked up at me again after a long moment. 3 years ago, he said slowly. "Were you working at St. Mary's Hospital?" The question landed somewhere behind my ribs. "Yes," I said. "I was." Raymond exhaled. It was a long, slow breath. Now the kind a person releases when they've been carrying something without realizing it, and finally find somewhere to set it down. He closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, the uncertainty was completely gone. "I was in a car accident," he said. He wasn't speaking loudly, but the people still seated nearby had grown quiet enough to hear him clearly. "A serious one. I was brought in by ambulance, critical condition." Owen had returned from the edge of the dance floor, drawn back by some instinct that his father's posture was different than it had been a few minutes ago. He stood behind his father's chair and listened. The roads into that part of the city were blocked that night, Raymond continued. There was a large protest, a significant one, and traffic was completely stopped in every direction. Most of the attending physicians were delayed. Some of them couldn't reach the hospital for hours. He paused. The table was very quiet now. Even two of Owen's aunts, who had been deep in their own conversation, had stopped speaking. For nearly 6 hours, he said, there was one person who stayed with me consistently, who monitored everything, who talked to me so I didn't lose track of where I was. He looked at me steadily. That was you. I didn't say anything. I remembered that night. I remembered it in the specific way you remember nights that fold themselves permanently into your memory, regardless of whether you want them to. A man with silver hair and a badly damaged left shoulder and 3 fractured ribs and a blood pressure reading that had made the intake nurse's expression go very carefully blank. I had stayed because leaving wasn't something I could have done and still been the person I understood myself to be. She monitored my breathing, Raymond said, speaking to Owen now, and to the table, and to the room that had begun to quiet in its outermost edges as people noticed something important happening somewhere near the center. She checked my pulse every few minutes. She kept me oriented. She talked to me about completely ordinary things, what the weather had been like that week, what was growing in her hospital's small garden on the 3rd floor, things that had nothing to do with how serious the situation was, and that was exactly the point. He paused. If she had stepped away even once for any significant length of time, he said carefully, I don't believe I would have been stable when the doctors finally arrived. Owen stared at me. The expression on his face was one I had seen before, in hallways and waiting rooms, on family members who had just understood something about a moment they had been living alongside without fully comprehending it. You saved my father, he said quietly. I was doing my job, I said. No, Raymond said. He said it firmly but without drama, the way a person speaks when they want to be precise rather than theatrical. You were doing something beyond your job. Your job was to monitor and report. What you did was stay. For 6 hours, you stayed. The room was genuinely quiet now. The band had not stopped playing, but the music felt very far away. Raymond turned toward the head of the table, toward Lily. She was standing at the edge of the dance floor, having drifted back at some point during the conversation, and her face had taken on a color that wasn't quite embarrassment and wasn't quite something else. It was the expression of someone who understands that they have stepped into a room they cannot exit gracefully. You introduced her, Raymond said, as just a nurse. He didn't say it with heat. He didn't need to. I understand that people use that phrase without thinking, he continued. He was calm in the way that people with real authority are sometimes calm, which is to say that the calmness itself is the most significant thing in the room. But you should know that the woman you just described that way is the reason your new husband has a father sitting at his wedding table tonight. Lily said nothing. For the first time in an entire evening of performances and introductions and cheerful commentary, she had nothing available to say. Owen walked around the table and extended his hand to me. I shook it. Several of Raymond's relatives near the center of the table began speaking quietly to one another. One older woman near the end looked at Lily for a moment with an expression that required no translation. A few guests who had laughed earlier at Lily's introduction found different places to look. I felt deeply uncomfortable, the way I always do when attention collects around me without warning, and I said again that I had just been doing what the situation required. Raymond looked at me for a long moment after that. Yes, he agreed, and that is exactly the point. The evening continued. The band played. People danced and drank and said the things people say at weddings. But something structural had shifted in the room in a way that couldn't be reversed by music or champagne or the cutting of a very expensive cake. I stayed for another hour. I said goodnight to Owen's family. Raymond shook my hand when I left and held it for a moment longer than a standard handshake requires, and I understood that he was communicating something specific that he had decided didn't need to be spoken aloud. Lily didn't look at me as I collected my coat. I walked out into the cool night air and stood on the pavement for a moment before calling a car. The city moved around me the way it always does. indifferent and continuous and completely unconcerned with what had just happened inside that hall. I thought about the night 3 years ago, the blocked roads, the delayed physicians, the man with silver hair whose blood pressure I had watched climb, and then, very gradually, stabilize over 6 tense, quiet hours while I talked to him about nothing important. I had not known his name. I had not known his son's name. I had not known anything about him except what his chart told me and what his face told me, which was that he was frightened in the specific way that very controlled people are frightened, which is to say almost invisibly, and that the best thing I could offer him was the steady, ordinary fact of my presence. I had not stayed because I expected anything from it. That was never why I stayed. 2 weeks after the wedding, the letter arrived at the hospital. It was addressed to the nursing department, specifically to the director, and it was written on the kind of letterhead that makes administrative staff hold an envelope slightly more carefully before opening it. Raymond Ashworth. I learned his full name from the letter. The letter described what had happened at St. Mary's 3 years ago in careful, specific detail. It described the blocked roads, the delayed physicians, the 6 hours of continuous monitoring. It named me by full name and nursing credential. It was signed by Raymond Ashworth, who was, as the letterhead made clear, the founding chairman of the Ashworth Medical Foundation. The foundation, which I had heard of but never had any particular reason to research closely, funds nursing education programs and emergency care initiatives across 11 hospitals in the region. It provides full scholarships for advanced nursing degrees. It endows positions. It builds departments. Attached to the letter was a second document. It was an offer, a formal, detailed, irrevocable offer of a fully funded position as the inaugural recipient of the Ashworth Emergency Care Fellowship, which had been established the previous quarter and had not yet been publicly announced. The fellowship included a full salary continuation during a 2-year advanced degree program, a named research position upon completion, and a seat on the Foundation's Nursing Advisory Board. It also included a clause I read 3 times before I fully understood it. The fellowship would be named after the recipient. The Ava Mercer Emergency Nursing Fellowship. My director called me into her office the morning the letter arrived. She placed it on the desk between us and looked at me the way people look at someone they are attempting to fully understand for the first time. "Did you know who he was?" she asked. 3 years ago, that night. Did you know?" "No," I said. She was quiet for a moment. "And at the wedding?" "No," I said again. "Not until he told everyone." She looked at the letter once more. Then she looked at me. "He's not asking for anything," she said. "He's not requesting your time or your endorsement or any kind of public acknowledgement. He just wants the fellowship named after you and the position filled by you." She folded her hands on the desk. He said, and I'm quoting directly from a phone call he made to me this morning, "and that the name of the fellowship matters because the people who receive it in the future should know exactly what kind of nurse they are being asked to become." I didn't say anything. I had spent 34 years being quiet in rooms where other people made noise. I had spent my entire career in spaces where the work was urgent and the credit was distributed in ways that had very little to do with who actually stayed. I looked at the letter. I thought about a man with silver hair and 3 fractured ribs and blood pressure that no one should be conscious through, asking me in the small hours of a blocked and exhausted night what had been growing in the hospital garden. I thought about a wedding reception, a simple navy dress, a hand placed on my shoulder with a particular kind of familiar contempt. I thought about a room going quiet. "What do you need from me?" I asked my director. She slid the acceptance form across the desk. I picked up the pen. Outside the window, the hospital continued its ordinary, extraordinary work. Somewhere in the building, in rooms I knew by number and by the particular sounds their monitors made, people were having the worst days of their lives, and the nurses were staying. They were always staying. That is the thing no one thinks to mention until the moment it becomes the only thing that matters. I signed my name.